Hello. You're wondering, why is he wearing a mask? Why did Zorro, the TV hero, wear a mask? To protect his identity. In this video and the next, I will talk about how existing movements can respond to crises in a way that helps the victims of disasters and also helps multiply movements. This first video is about starting with the end in mind. What lessons have we learned in past disasters that helped us start with the end in mind during this crisis? In short, loss can become gain. When most people see a big wave, we avoid it because we sense its destructive energy that could wipe us out. But a skilled surfer swims towards a wave like this because they think they can harness its energy. We call this energy transformation. Transforming destructive energy by harnessing a lever in order to achieve productive gain. An earthquake hit an area followed by a tsunami. Many people near the beach lost their lives. An area of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer in the city was completely turned into a giant mixer where rooftops were found 5 meters under the mud. In another area, houses rode down a river of mud like they were river boats. 3 days before this earthquake, 7 of our leaders from a different region had flown in to try to catalyze a movement in this area. All 7 lost their lives in this earthquake. Of the 210 believers in the area, the top leader was killed, and many of the other believers moved to other areas because they could no longer rebuild where they had owned land. We lost connection with all 210 believers. We had to start over. It was a great loss due to the destructive force of the earthquake and the tsunami. But could that same energy be used to drive God's kingdom forward? What levers did we have that could help things move towards gain? We had family ties between one of our catalysts and several families, about 100 people, who had lost their homes and lost 10 loved ones. So we began to use another lever, that is the lever of practical love. We began to supply temporary homes, clean water tanks, toilets, combined with spiritual mentoring. In the 22 months since that earthquake and tsunami struck, we have seen believer groups develop, with now 617 believers in 124 groups in 7 generations. God used this disaster to move from loss to gain. But we identified another need in that area. We had placed too much responsibility on the shoulders of too few leaders, and when we lost them, we lost everybody. So we had to start working more seriously with teams of leaders so that they could prepare the new leaders that could step in when needed. A crisis, of course, at the beginning looks very bleak. God used a persecution that happened after Stephen's martyrdom that forced all the believers out of the city of Jerusalem and spread the gospel widely. We must start after a crisis with the end in mind, that is the end that God has in mind. We need to remember that loss can become gain in the hands of God. What is the corona crisis in our country? The corona crisis is more multifaceted and more geographically broader than other crises we have experienced. Fear of illness is paralyzing. We've experienced 140 deaths. People have become very cautious. Many people have been laid off work and their reserves were quickly exhausted. The economy stopped. Sellers can't find buyers. Buyers can't find sellers. People lack food. Education is impeded from children to college students. People don't have the skills and the technology to move fully to online education. Donors around the world are also affected, reducing their ability to help us help others. Worst of all, we lost face-to-face contact with entire neighborhoods when most neighborhoods were barred with bamboo and metal bars. Personal contact is something we greatly need for crisis recovery and for small group multiplication. This loss of face-to-face contact is something we had never experienced. How did we develop our crisis plan? We used a full month to dialogue with our Ring 1 leaders and our Ring 2 leaders. And then they talked in many talks with key leaders in the field. We experimented on a small scale. Then we evaluated those experiments and made new adjustments. The brotherhood bonds that had been built between our top 20 leaders and the bonds each of them had built with their key leadership teams created the trust that was needed to make our discussions more open and more valuable. Because of great uncertainty, we realized our leaders needed clearer guidelines than we normally provided. These guidelines helped us synchronize with each other and also with stakeholders who were feeling more unsettled in this period than any other I have experienced. We increased the frequency of our communication with stakeholders. We identified our programs for phase 1 first. Things were so chaotic, we planned strong evaluations after each month-long phase with new adjustments to alter the next phase of programs. We use these evaluations to weave together and to cross-pollinate and cross-support, for our men had been emotionally battered by the deaths and by the needs of people all around them. What levers can we harness? Our first lever is the strength of our leaders' network within our small group network. We already have key volunteer leaders in place, connected by strong bonds of brotherhood and trust. These leaders are easily mobilized to make local decisions and mobilize volunteers for our corona crisis response. Our second lever is our experience in a wide variety of disasters. Our leaders have seen God use crises to multiply movements. After a period, they begin to multiply at twice their normal speed. So as they face this crisis, they face it with faith and expectation. Our third lever is opportunity for accelerated leadership development. Leaders get more experiences faster during a crisis. When combined with more frequent evaluations, this speeds up the development of young leaders. Fourth, though normal donations have slowed and our traveling ministries have been stopped because transportation has stopped, we have an increase in compassion-driven donors for a time. And we also have an increase in invitations for online ministries at a distance. The fifth lever we have used, online ministries, must be sharpened during corona pressure. These online skills we learn now will also be needed to support multiplication of groups later as they spread farther. Our sixth lever is the pause in our normal activities that is forced by Corona. This delay or pause is an opportunity for time-consuming desk work we had delayed, but we need it for infrastructure development. We are using these 6 levers to support crisis relief and recover and develop a basis for multiplication of groups. What programs are we doing in this Corona period? We are doing 6 Corona programs in a month-long phase, one by one, followed by evaluations. Our first program, Nutrition for the Hungriest, is dominant in the early relief months because so many thousands and thousands of people have been laid off and have trouble buying food. But our other 4 Corona programs, our other 5 Corona programs will increase as conditions allow us to do more recovery programs. We use the word nutrition because vegetables and fruit are given, which are rich in vitamins and nutrients. This strengthens immune systems. We use the word hungriest because our volunteer leaders select the neediest people in our small group networks. We bought entire harvests and fields and delivered them in truckloads to garages for younger leaders to distribute locally by motorcycle to each family. This process of buying in bulk lowered our prices and kept those farmers from going bankrupt. It also reduced our health risks because our people didn't have to go to the crowded markets, which were then closed. In the first month, we served 6,000 families, but upon evaluation, reduced that to 3,000 so we could give twice as much food to the neediest families the following month. How can we keep our leaders alive? How can we help them increase their pragmatic love and influence in their network? Our second program is Shorten Economic Systems. This program is paired with our nutrition program. Our country's economic system is broken, but we are repairing parts of it within our networks. Between buyer to seller, there had been a long chain of middlemen. Each part of that chain costs money. Every link of the chain is a new interpersonal contact that adds risk of illness. If in this long chain, several links were broken. Short chains are cheaper, safer, and more reliable. So our leaders work by phone to link together the chains in order to connect sellers to buyers directly, and also skilled people directly to those who need them with a minimum of contact. How can our leaders repair and shorten our economic segments within our own network first? How can doing this help heal the wider economy? How can doing this help us increase the political protection we need for our multiplying believer groups? The third program is social media for leaders. Our field leaders need phones to maintain communication with us, since face-to-face contact is usually not possible. Most member care, most training in leaders groups, most coaching must be done by phone. But because they have no food, some leaders must sell their phones, or they're not buying Wi-Fi packets or telephone minutes. So we're buying back their phones before they sell them. We're loaning them back to them to hold for us to have communication with them, or we're sending out minutes to those with whom we want to have meetings by phone. But we must do everything online. Leaders with no phones visit a leader who has a phone, so that as a small group they can connect to their distant coach by phone. We are working to increase the online skills of leaders through all the generations, step by step. We are making 5-minute training videos that we can send by WhatsApp. Online leader mentoring pushes out, decentralizes leadership, which is a good thing in a movement. How do we reimagine our developing leaders online? How can online leader development build leaders groups? How can our leaders increase their online skills now so that they are prepared to support distant fruit expansion? Our fourth program is Job Starts. Our Job Start program will increase as conditions improve. We help our leaders first. They need economic stability in order to help others. We also help the poorest, the most marginalized, the most destitute people who must restart their simple businesses in order to eat. They will try to do it without us, but we can help them reduce their risk of COVID and increase the likelihood of earning income with small microloan groups. We also create jobs that work alongside of our programs. We have done experimental programs that we can give us insight in how to best help jobs start or restart. So how do we help them? We help them form multi-purpose microloan groups. Microloan groups increase the likelihood of business success. They help revolve the money back around to others in the group to loan out to the next person. They also promote spiritual growth within those microloan groups. Which job restarts link with others? Food is one of the main things people are buying right now. We help farmers keep farming by buying from them in bulk. Otherwise, they can't sell. If they can't sell, they can't replant. And then this just widens the crisis even further. We've also created courier jobs that carry between the farmers and the beneficiaries. A chicken farmer was threatened by bankruptcy because he could not buy imported chicken feed. We paired him with another believer who knew how to make chicken feed from local products, symbiotically saving 2 jobs. How can leaders increase job starts? How can they help micro loan groups or farmers groups become multi-purpose groups that support spiritual growth? Our fifth program is grief and health support. In the first 2 months of the corona crisis, 140 of our people had died in our small group network, and thousands more were sick. These families have medical bills. Many have lost their income. They have burial costs. They need emotional and spiritual support. This takes a huge toll on our leaders. Our leaders, some of them have also died, and this underlines the need to strengthen our teams of leaders so that other leaders can quickly step forward to fill the gaps. How can our leaders help people deal with their losses near to God? Our sixth program we are prioritizing during the pause period of Corona is more internal. To recover from the Great Depression, the U.S. government built infrastructure. We find that a crisis is an important time to build infrastructure. We prioritize the health of our top leaders, for we have invested in them for a long time, and they're very fruitful in God's work. We don't want to lose them. We are doing a time-consuming revision of our system of tracking leadership teams. Then we can better develop our leadership teams over each wide region and over each small region. We are also developing our Bible and our mentoring tools. What leader skills can grow even better during a crisis? Well, volunteer leaders learn more quickly during a crisis to love compassionately and love pragmatically in practical ways. They learn to strengthen and utilize the networks of leaders under them. They grow at creative problem solving in teams. Leaders increase their online leadership, coaching, and caregiving. Leaders of neighborhood small groups can learn to be family priests in their own homes, making a small believer group there. Leaders can learn to negotiate socially, to increase social wealth in their network of multiplying believer groups. Our conviction that loss can become gain must be approached with humble faith. We first ask the question, what needs to be done to support movement multiplication during a crisis? Second, we ask, what will I do? What is my personal part? How can I invest for Him? How can I synchronize with God? Third, we ask the question, is my faith increasing during this crisis? Remember, Jesus put His disciples in boats and stirred up storms and wind to test and to build their faith. Am I trusting God, knowing there is a lot I cannot control, yet doing my part? How can I move with God by faith, expecting God will move in amazing ways that I cannot imagine? In breakout groups of 4 people, discuss these questions. Help each other clarify and commit to take action steps. Facilitators, please leave these questions on the screen so the small groups will be able to look at them as they discuss them. This video, starting with the end in mind, is part 1 of a 2-part series entitled Strategic Crisis Response and Movements.
Zorro wore a mask on television to protect his identity. Today we will be talking about strategic crisis response and multiplying movements. We will be talking about sustainable recovery. How do we respond to a crisis strategically to sustain recovery while multiplying movements? Now, over the past 20 years, our teams responded to earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, tsunamis, mudslides, whirlwinds, social economic turmoil, and the corona crisis. We identified 10 principles that help support recovery and catalyze movements during crises. These principles help us to quickly evaluate conditions, the possible solutions. They help us decentralize decision-making. They help us empower field leaders to meet local needs, and they help us coordinate field workers and budgets. These principles help us improve our holistic recovery and our support of the multiplication of believer groups. The first principle is energy transformation. A disaster generates enormous energy. That energy can be destructive, but it can also be harnessed. So a skilled surfer facing an enormous wave that could destroy him uses his surfboard as a lever to harness the power of the wave. He leverages the destructive energy into productive gain. A disaster can tear apart families and communities, but it can also strengthen them. During the months after a crisis, movements can begin to multiply more quickly than during normal times if we skillfully harness the energy generated by the crisis. So we ask the questions, what levers do we have? What assets do victims have? How can these be used to support holistic recovery? After one tsunami, teachers were grieving their losses. More than 200,000 lives had been lost. They were also worried about their children, their school children, who had lost their parents. Now, these teachers were themselves victims, but they were also assets to help the children recover. Their concern for their students could be leveraged to produce positive gain. Now, our people before the disaster were training counselors. And after the disaster in this region, they gave teachers low-budget counseling seminars. Our team trained the teachers, and then the teachers counseled the school children. The training allowed the teachers to put their worry into constructive work. they replicated our model to help the school children. The second principle was long-term thinking. Now, in a crisis, most volunteers focus on the immediate needs of crisis victims. But our leaders start with the end in mind. We help with immediate needs in light of long-term needs. We identify first steps that link with the next phases of a long-term community and spiritual recovery. After an earthquake leveled thousands of houses, we formed groups of victims to build shelters for themselves. We showed them how to build cheap bamboo frames set in cement so that termites wouldn't eat the poles. We adapted a local building method so that unskilled victims could build them. They formed into groups of 8 families. Our team demonstrated for each group how to build one bamboo tarp shelter. Each group would then build the remaining 7 shelters for the remaining 7 families. This allowed our one-car crew with very limited budget to quickly build 700 shelters. It also helped the earthquake victims to form these self-help groups, which would be needed in the next phases of both crisis recovery and also spiritual recovery. Later, these same groups of families worked together to build their more permanent house cores on a limited budget. Now, some groups worked together to build their house foundations. Then they joined to make concrete blocks. They figured out how many concrete blocks they would need to sell in order to buy the next truckload of sand and cement, and also pay themselves some wages that they could use on food. They would then have the remaining blocks set aside as building blocks to rebuild their own houses. In these groups, brotherhood bonds were strengthened, and they began to discuss spiritual recovery. Spiritual needs are pushed to the surface by a crisis. We engage groups of victims who grow to transfer spiritual life to the next generation. Most volunteers serve individuals, but we only serve victims who organize recovery groups. Groups support both disaster recovery and also spiritual multiplication. When disaster victims work together, they can do more with less budget. And then the solutions match the local needs and local resources. When they work in groups, they lay a foundation to continue to work together in the later phases of disaster recovery. And they're building bonds of brotherhood that through the development of trust, they can have spiritual transformation and multiplication of small groups. Through cooperative work, more people benefit at a lower cost with deeper, longer-lasting results. In one area, after a volcano had buried many homes, we found the victims sleeping in a schoolyard very discouraged. We asked them questions, and they began to tell us what assets they had. They described that they had many fallen logs. We helped them work together to build a simple sawmill on lone land, and also with simple woodworking tools have an adjacent shop for building door frames and window frames. This sawmill and woodworking shop gave jobs and income to 6 workers. See, we had looked past the immediate needs to help them work together to create businesses with a sustainable income for the long term. Now, everyone needed clean water after a different disaster because the eruption of a volcano had filled wells with lava. The rainwater was plentiful, but it was seasonal, and the water was contaminated with acidic ash. The local victims formed groups to wrestle with these issues. They split bamboo poles into bamboo gutters, attached them to the roof, and then they made rainfall catchment tanks out of local materials and also filtering systems. The local groups were thinking and working together so that on a low budget they could meet their own spiritual needs. These groups, which were initially formed just for disaster recovery, soon transitioned into places where they could have spiritually transforming dialogue. The group members support each other's search for spiritual meaning. It's difficult to be on a spiritual journey alone in these collectivist cultures. Groups validate people's efforts to find spiritual peace. They provide protection. It's vital for spiritual and emotional issues to be discussed in these self-formed groups. Our fourth principle is victims as workers. We look at victims as workers. They're initiative-taking, socially engaged disaster victims are the people that can organize the others to discover and then implement recovery for their community. This process of working behind these local organizers builds hope because their hopes have been dashed after the crisis. Socially active victims will bring benefits to more people. We look at victims as workers. Some of the victims are initiative-taking, and they help the others get organized and discover solutions and implement recovery for their community. This idea of working together under these organizers gives them hope because their hopes have been dashed by the crisis. Now, they tend to choose more socially active victims with good character who can organize others as their organizers. The local people know their own people, who they should choose. In one farming community, volcanic ash had covered their crops. They needed another way to make a living. Disaster victims were taught by artists from outside the area how to make certain handicraft products. The volunteers from outside designed the products, trained the workers, and marketed the products. But the local organizers were needed. They were the ones that sent the message out to 5 nearby villages, who each sent 4 to 8 villagers to be trained. After learning how to produce good quality products, these people trained others in their villages to make these products. And then one of the villages began to emerge as the leading village where the chief organizer lived. Over time, they took on a system of 5 villages working together, and for a year they lived off the income of these handicrafts while their crops were recovering. In a different disaster, after a different earthquake, thousands of houses were destroyed. The victims were put together in groups, and they began building steel-reinforced 3-meter by 6-meter house cores as pictured here. They cleaned and reused their bricks. They found good roof tiles in the rubble and window frames, and they built their houses over their foundations and over their floors. So they built good quality earthquake-resistant homes on a limited budget. They did this by working in groups of 8. One trained mason could support 4 groups of 8 building their houses. Now, this is also true in the spiritual arena. Victims with special interest feel safe if discussion is in groups, but we want the local people to begin to lead the questions and facilitate the group. So we give them a very simple set of questions, 7 questions to discuss God's Word. As a result, they begin to start new groups and lead those groups also. The 5th principle is observe, question, and add. In a crisis, relief workers often give prepackaged solutions. We have learned that it's more effective to ask the local victims to develop their own solutions using their local assets. Now, we observe and question. We want to know what the challenge is like from the point of view of the victims. We encourage the local people to identify their assets, to explore their alternatives, and to find their solutions. The solutions they develop are usually cheaper, they're better matched to local conditions, they're more enthusiastic about them, so these are solutions that are more sustainable. After a volcanic eruption, I had begun discussions with victims in refugee camps who discussed the many fallen trees. And I already mentioned that they made a sawmill and a wood shop. But in this particular discussion, they were wondering if I would buy them a good chainsaw. Once we determined the budget, I said you can use that to buy 1 good chainsaw, or you can buy 2 cheaper chainsaws if you would like. Because it was their idea, they bore without complaint the heavier and cheaper chainsaws. These 2 chainsaws kept 2 crews working in 2 shifts, a total of 4 work groups. They planned to carry the logs with many men, but they liked the idea I added of creating a 2-wheeled cart on which they could move the logs more easily. We do the same thing when we start spiritual discussions. In spiritual dialogue, we observe and we ask about the victim's needs related to the recovery activity that they're involved in. Around their topic, what they want to talk about, we invite them to share their spiritual insights. The 6th principle is transformative dialogue. Now, disasters open windows of spiritual interest. Now, we must view the disaster victims holistically and guide spiritual dialogue that links between their practical concerns and their spiritual concerns. In farmers' recovery groups, after a volcanic ash had buried the crops, a transformative dialogue took them back to the Garden of Eden, to how man's sins led to difficulties in growing crops. Dialogue helps them wrestle with the question, why did God allow suffering? Dialogue helps victims see themselves as God's representatives over his creation. God has tasked them with managing his blessings and given them the responsibility to provide for everyone's needs, including the widows. This kind of discussion helps the victims trust God and then share the scarce resources without fear. Transformative dialogue discusses the return of the Messiah, who one day will usher in a creation recovery that's perfect. We know that cousins have an integrated worldview, unlike the secularized worldview of the West. So they must be served with a holistic approach. Bridges of dialogue are needed. They're built on common ground, such as the prophets from Adam to Abraham to David to Jesus. These dialogues draw on local culture, and they also draw initially on both holy books. The thirsty are invited, and after a time, the focus is only on the holy books, starting with Adam. Forming recovery groups is the first step, and then adding spiritual dialogue into those recovery groups is the next step as we build the trust between group members and they share their insights. Recovery groups begin to discuss spiritual truth, and over a process of time, these are greenhouses that provide arena for the believers to grow and form a small group of believers. These groups then provide a simple model that can multiply quickly and inexpensively, replicating without the need for outside resources. The 7th principle is sharing movement principles in autonomous teams. Management after disasters can typically become centralized, bureaucratic, slow, and out of touch. The best results come when field teams share a common set of movement principles, but yet have independent teams. Our field leaders support each other and they maintain unity through joining together during coordination meetings. Coordination meetings have 4 purposes. 1, to gain better understanding of recovery challenges through multiple people's eyes. 2, to link the resources and synchronize. 3, to provide cross-training by evaluating case studies together. And 4, to clarify principles behind decisions that are being made on the field. Field leaders must make decisions in the field based on movement principles without the delay of having to check back with supervisors. They develop the understanding of these principles as they evaluate together, and then they make revisions to their plans. Spiritually, multiplication happens as we share case studies. Spiritual challenges and solutions are discussed together, and this reinforces the movement principles. Principle 8, innovation. A disaster impoverishes an area. Normal building processes are not enough. We need innovation. in order to recover. But innovation is costly and it's risky. How do we help develop an environment where innovation occurs and we reduce the risk and the cost? One of the ways we do this is through small-scale experiments. They try the best idea they have. They trust God. After a certain period, they evaluate together. They make improvements. They make another experiment. And stage by stage, we have a much more efficient process that brings more benefits to more people. Most workers after a crisis are near cultural workers. But what we need is multicultural synergy. Local and near culture people can operate more effectively with fewer obstacles in the local disaster area. But selected distant culture workers can lift the people's spirits and can play complementary roles during crisis recovery. Outsiders are barely tolerated, but after a crisis, they're welcomed because people realize that their area is so impoverished, they need people who can help them bridge to outside ideas and outside resources. Near culture and local workers can build links and develop local endorsement. But when they effectively link together with distant cultural people, it often can be a great synergistic combination after a heavy disaster. Now, disaster victims have lost much and they have few options. They need people who join hands, who are of good character, who love God and others, they're trustworthy, and they know how to share and work together with others. Principle 10 is fruit-based management. Most disaster responses focus on activities, but we must focus on fruit, on outcomes, on benefits for victims. We have to identify certain fruit markers, ways of measuring. These help us set direction, track progress, and improve. Open discussion of progress towards outcomes will lead us to revising and improving so that we increase our fruit. We track fruit markers during crisis recovery such as house cores built, jobs restarted, recovery groups formed, seminars conducted on family conflicts, trauma recovery seminars, recovery groups that become believer groups. We use these kinds of fruit markers to celebrate progress. Fruitful teams strategically implement 10 disaster principles. These principles support recovery with movement multiplication. Like the surfer, enjoy riding the power of God's wave. Now, break into groups of 4 people. Discuss the following questions. Help each other identify action steps each of you will take and commit to doing them. Facilitators, please leave these questions on the board so that people can refer to them during the discussion groups. This video has been part 2 of a 2-part series entitled Strategic Crisis Response and Multiplying Movements. This has been a video on sustainable recovery. Thank you.